Welcome to the Intersecting Us podcast, where math and life intersect.
In today's episode, Brian and Dave discuss imagination, reality, and artificial minds, an attempt to decode intelligence.
What if non-physical things really existed? Is that something you can get your mind around? If you were going to draw a picture of a non-physical thing, what would that look like? This is what we're going to talk about a little bit today on our podcast about non-physical things. Last time we talked about imaginary things and beautiful equations. The time before that, we had some conversations about what it means to have a non-physical presence and how that works in eternity. And we're going to hit that some again. So Dave, I'll bring you in here. Just get us started. And I do this a lot when I do presentations. I'll have people, we'll be reading a text or something, and I'll say, now let's imagine this. So what I always have to do, and if you're the one driving the car right now, I don't recommend this, but if you're not, I always have to close my eyes. And then somehow I'm able to, for some reason that, it gets the picture of what's right in front of me out of there. So at least gives me a little bit better shot. But Dave, if you don't have to close your eyes if you don't want to, but I know you're not driving. But if I say, we've talked about a non-physical being maybe starting everything, and but we have non-physical parts of ourselves that some people call spirit, some people call soul. And we've talked about the possibility of those existing. When you think about and I go either way you want, just a non-physical thing, whether it's a being, yourself, what do you see? What do you imagine?
Oh, boy. I tell you, I love using my imagination to do math. And for me, those math questions are, I think, actually easier than some questions you throw at me, Brian. And it really stretches my imagination, which is good. But just thinking very simplistically, I always like to think of the wind blowing, that I don't see the wind, but I can see the effects of the wind. And then I've been told by others that is sometimes a good analogy for kind of like spiritual things, the spiritual beings, that maybe we don't actually see those spiritual things physically, but we can see the effects of those things. And so in my very simple mind, I often go down that route because it makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I think that's good. When I've asked this question to people, sometimes they'll come back, I just saw darkness. I just saw nothing. And I'm like, part of me is like, good. I think you've completely imagined what a non-physical thing is, because it's obviously by definition non-physical. What we try to do is bring it into maybe a physical idea. And then when we open our eyes, it's not there again. And of course, there's a difference. You get into some really interesting metaphysical things there, because the reality, a lot of, it doesn't even have to be religions, different worldviews about what those things that exist. And then you got other people who think if you think those things exist, that you need to be in a padded cell. It's just kind of that you're thinking of things that aren't real. And we call that schizophrenia when you get to the point where you things that aren't real, you think are real, and then it affects you. And so I don't want you to be schizophrenic. I don't want that. But if people did see nothing, that is kind of the point. But just because we don't see it, and I think your wind analogy is pretty good. And this is what it comes down to. Just because we don't see something doesn't mean it's not real. And that gets that real word in there. Maybe it'd be good, because obviously this is math and life. This is kind of more the life side on this particular podcast, but there is a term called real numbers. So I thought maybe you could give us, and I think I'm saying this right, what is the antithesis? Because there's real numbers, but that doesn't make up all the numbers. So what else is there? In life, we might say what's the antithesis or what's the opposite. But in math, if you got real numbers and that's not everything, what other kind of numbers do you have?
Well, there's a set that contains the real numbers that's bigger than the real numbers. So if you think about like maybe the real numbers might be a box, then there's a bigger box where the box of real numbers completely is inside this other box. So the bigger box is called the complex numbers. And so within the complex numbers are all the real numbers. So every real number is a complex number, but not every complex number is a real number. So there are numbers in the complex numbers that are not real. And those numbers simply involve the imaginary number I. So 1 plus 2i is a complex number, and it is not a real number because you have I in that expression. And so that would be an example of a complex number that is not a real number. And so it may not be the opposite of a real number, but it's what's in the set of complex numbers that is not a real number.
So I think I like this, and this is what we've been doing throughout our whole existence as Intersecting Us with videos and podcasts and stories. And it's the idea of how the math concept can start, and then what we would maybe call the life concept, how they intersect. Because as you were saying that, for instance, if we find out that there was, and this sounds kind of morbid, but it's the one that comes to mind. You find out that you go into a room and somebody has a knife in the back, and they're dead. And it's real. They're really dead. So you're the detective. You go in there and you get somebody on the stand that has witnessed, apparently was there when it happened. And they say, well, this being popped out of nowhere, grabbed a knife, stabbed him in the back, and then popped back out into nothingness. Now, I might, if I'm the prosecuting attorney there, I might say, yeah, but is that real? Was that real? You see, it again, that's the same word you just used with math, but it's obviously a little bit, different idea, but that's not completely a different idea because, you said in some ways, and I don't know if this is grammatically correct, but I'm going to use it anyway for our concepts, that you could say that the opposite or a difference from a real number is an imaginary number. I mean, we'll go with that for now. Well, you could say that here too. It's like, did you imagine that guy, popping into nothing, and how much credibility would we give that witness who thought that, or that, an angel did it, or a jinn, if you're a Muslim, the different beings that are out there. It's like, that's when we're getting this metaphysical stuff about non-physical things, but we've even talked about non-physical beings or even a non-physical self. What is real? This is where we're getting into some really cool, what we call metaphysics, because that's kind of what the definition of metaphysics, what is real? That really exists that we can't measure. That's
right. And to maybe complete the analogy within the set of real numbers, and of course these are just math terms, so it doesn't necessarily mean these are the best terms that are out there, but it's what math people have come up with. And they've come up with the terminology that there's two sets of numbers within the real numbers, and one set they call the rational numbers, and then the other set they call the irrational numbers. So as mathematicians, what we're saying is, quote, real is anything that is rational or anything that is irrational.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's not, imaginary is not real.
Well, that's what you could say to say, we still got the same courtroom, and we say, you could say it differently. It says, okay, you're thinking something popped in, and I could be a nice philosopher lawyer. I could say, well, that's possible, but is it really rational? Or is that more of an irrational state? Again, that's a little different than we're talking about, but the words are still there. And I think when we come back all down to it, last week we talked about, Euler's beautiful equation. Well, it's real in some ways, but it's not. It's almost like you get back to Plato, if you remember his forms. I'm looking at a chair across this room. That's an instance of a chair, but there's the perfect chair form, or the color brown, or the color red, or anything you want to use. And there's a whole bunch of different philosophical things about that. But that's that formula. It's real, but it's not something you can. It doesn't take up space. I mean, using a pen or something on your paper. Well, that's real. I know that's physical, but the actual formula itself kind of exists it's almost like an abstract object. It's got a form, but doesn't have any weight. How much does Euler's beautiful equation weigh? How long is it? Well, it doesn't really make any, those are category errors, and it's the same thing with people say. I remember, reading a study of, and we may have talked about this before, but anyway, reading a study about somebody wanted to find how much the soul weighed. I mean, seriously, a human soul. So they did a bunch of, I think it was like 300 different deaths where they weighed the body before the death and after the death. And it came out, I can't remember the exact, it was insignificant when it comes to weight, but there was a difference. But so they had said, but is that a category error? It's just like, what color is the wind? It's just like, well, that's a category error. It doesn't have color, and that's, anything like that. What color is math? It just doesn't make sense. So when you come back into this, we have something. So you have real in math that kind of talks about imaginary is kind of, and then in life, we use that somewhat, but really probably the antithesis of real and this is not too hard because you just put the negative in front of it, is not real, but how would we define not real in life? We might use the word imaginary, or we might use a word that's become pretty popular for lots of reasons in our culture. We could use the word artificial. And now you put that in front of something. So like, I remember, I did have the beauty or the privilege, I guess, of playing football, American football, if you're listening outside, not the other part, the soccer, but for a number of years into college. And sometimes we'd be on grass, and somehow we'd do all this stuff called artificial turf, because it wasn't real grass. We use that term, artificial. But the one I'm thinking about, and we talked about this a little bit last week, so we won't get into that particular part, but we're going to get a little bit deeper into this, is the term artificial intelligence, which the way we've gone so far, we would say that's not real intelligence. Because if we defined intelligence as the ability to create, I suppose, complex ideas by yourself, within your own, and that might not be the greatest definition, but hey, our podcast, that's what we're going to use right now. You can certainly put comments in there if there's a better definition, but being able, if you're intelligent, it's not intelligent. We could have a mynah bird can say the same thing that Euler could have said, but it's not intelligence, it's just repeating it. It's not coming from itself, where intelligence is something that comes from a being, Well, we're saying that these Chat GPT, or I always want to put a robot because it makes it easier to come, a robot who's doing tasks, that may be intelligent, but it's artificial intelligence. It's not real intelligence. So when you hear those two terms, Dave, I don't know if the math thing helps, but just in general, what would you say, and it's a little bit opening question, but we'll try to maybe answer it together. But what would you say would be the difference between real intelligence and artificial intelligence? How could you tell the difference?
Mm-hmm. I think we touched on this in a previous podcast, but one of the foundations of math, of course, are proofs. And up until just the last 30 years, all proofs were done by humans writing on paper. And about 30 years ago, there was this 4-color problem that was trying to be proved, where you could color a map with only 4 colors. And I'm not going to get into all the details of it. But the idea was that this theorem was proved by a computer algorithm. In other words, someone wrote a program, and in that program, it proved that this theorem was true. But it was, and it still is, debated amongst mathematicians as to whether this proof is acceptable or not, because there's new things that get introduced into a proof when you bring a computer into it. And so is it possible the computer made a mistake? the volume of data that the computer generated was so much that no human was going to be able to verify every calculation. And so you almost needed a computer to check the computer. Well, then you're no better off than you were before, because how can you trust that other computer? And so I think that is an example where in the math world, they're wrestling with what would be considered an acceptable math proof. Can we allow computer programming into that world? And that still has people on both sides of the camp.
And I do think you see that in science and in other things. I mean, I know professors I've talked to, this is science, would be more in education, but, harder and harder to determine whether, a term paper has been generated by the person who turned it in or some sort of artificial intelligent program that, you can tell these things. I know Bard's that way, ChatGPT say, write me a paper based on, write me a 5,000 page paper on, whatever the concept is. And it just does it for you. And it's hard to tell the difference. And this is it's interesting because in our series for eternity, what happens when you do eternity in physical world? We talked about the universe. You keep going backwards to try to find, the beginning of something. And then it is our universe eternal past. We talked about how that was what was believed until the Big Bang cosmology came out. And that seems to be not true physically. But then we talked about, well, what's before that? And we got into the idea of maybe a non-physical being that created all that. But that's the key, I think, created. I think that's the word. Does this artificially intelligent program or robot or whatever you want to call it that creates proofs for math or is able to beat the best chess players in the world, somebody had to create it and put in the concepts for it to be able to look intelligent. And I think maybe that is the answer to try to figure out the difference between real and artificial is if you can figure out the creator. That may not be the only thing, but I think it's important. Which brings us back to our, of course, our own existential ideas about humanity. What is our purpose? What is our end game? Why are we here? The philosophical questions that everybody asks at some time in their life. It does kind of depend on the creator, because if you get the movies and stuff, if you get a creator that makes the bad robot, if it's a bad evil creator, then is it the robot's fault that it's doing evil things? Well, it's just doing what it's programmed to do. But we wouldn't say that about somebody, a person, right? That's the difference between, I think we talked about last time, sentience and sapience. A lion can eat a zebra and we don't arrest it. But, if we kill another person and try to eat them, then that's usually seen as a no-no, as a moral. Well, do you put morality on artificial intelligence? These are the questions that are out there. And these, I think, minds that are mathematical or scientific can help these things because science is right in the middle of this stuff. And where do we stop? And there's people that are really, and fear it can be a great motivator. There are people scared, that like we're going to start doing stuff that even I've talked to people that are scared of artificial intelligence driving a car by itself. I don't want to be on the road with one of those. What about you, Dave? Are you pro self-driving car? Or even talk about why would somebody worry about that?
Well, I think it's one of those things that one mistake is pretty costly because it often will involve lives, where if I make a mistake in my job, it's probably going to be a pretty minor offense. But a mistake in artificial driving is at high stakes. And so normally I'm not of the camp where I'm worrying about mistakes. In fact, I like to encourage mistakes, but I'm not in the camp of saying I want to encourage mistakes in artificial driving. That's something where we want to be pretty sure about before we pull the trigger on going forward with that.
Yeah, and I think that's the good thing is when we weigh whether or not to do a particular thing. It's not always just a numbers game, not to be, no pun intended about the math stuff, but it isn't always that. There's more to it. And I think you can, from what I've read, and again, it hasn't been a lot, but you could make a case that if it's done well and the highways are set up correctly and all that, the mistakes that a computer, we'll just go with that, artificially intelligent computer would make in driving are going to be less than a person. A self-driving car doesn't get tired. A self-driving car isn't seeing what's on the radio. A self-driving car isn't talking on the cell phone with one hand, and you know what I mean? Or I've done the interstate a couple weeks ago, and somebody was driving with their foot out the window. Well, a self-driving car wouldn't do that, So what I mean, the user error, you wouldn't have to worry about it. I know I had an uncle that was, or a cousin that was a truck driver, and they have rules how long they can drive because they get tired. They can only put so many miles in or hours in a particular day or week. Well, you wouldn't have to do that with, because they don't.
Yeah.
So, but even if, and I'll answer this myself, even if I saw the math, I saw the statistics that says that self-driving, artificially intelligently driven cars were more safe because of the decisions they make, I still would step back and say, I'm not sure I'm ready. Because it's artificial.
Right.
Where is there? And it's the same thing you were talking about with the proofs. Are we missing something here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are they going to all of a sudden veer over because of some algorithm and knock out every car in the freeway? You just worry about that. Yeah.
I think our best bet at being most safe on this is if we go to artificial intelligence is that we go 100% where all the cars are artificial intelligent and the cars can communicate to each other. Because then I think we have a much more solid solution than you have an artificial intelligent car and then you have a human car going down the highway and they're not going to be speaking together. And I think that there could be tremendous value is if everything is computer driven and the computers are communicating with each other, then unless there's some glitch in the system, which of course is still the biggest concern, to me it seems like it could have great potential to be a much safer environment.
Yeah, and I think that's what the goal is. But you get into when you're talking about human things and then you get into the idea of morality, what is good. I mean, again, the computer's not. It's going to make a determination on what is good. I'm not saying that, but it doesn't really have a moral intuition, of what is good and what is not. And you get into that, and not that I was thinking about that, but this will be a good advertisement for eventually our next video series. It'll come in a few months about rules and sports and all that kind of stuff. We'll get into morality and ethics and stuff and how different ways of doing that because they're not as clear cut as we think. But one of the things I wanted to get into, and as we get toward the end here, is the idea of, and we talked about this non-physical, because I think we're kind of hitting that. This intelligence is, I don't know if non-physical is quite the right word, but it's certainly not human intelligence. But the idea of relating to those things, because I've seen it, it's been out there. Now they're talking about, would somebody be able to have a relationship with a artificially intelligent robot? So, it would make it easier. I guess the dating apps would be easy. You just get on the dating app and they just send you one, or, it'd be much easier for people. They wouldn't have all the mental anguish and stuff. So, but that's getting into something different, isn't it? When you're talking about words like, because we've used words, in this, even in the math side, about beauty, goodness, well, truth certainly, but even the word love comes in there. Can you, I get kind of sounds blunt to say it this way. Can you fall in love with a computer? That's I'm not saying you really like your MacBook. I mean, that's like liking chocolate or something, yeah, we can all do that, but I really have a relationship with, because it's, with that, we're talking about an artificially intelligent, I almost said being, and do we even call it that? Does this have sentience, or is it just just kind of a real developed or computer? Because wouldn't it all come down? Attributes would come down to how it was created, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you get but there's a lot of philosophical things going in here, and even religious things. What are we talking about? Morality. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? People are talking about this stuff because COVID kind of got everybody not everybody, but some people to interact with people less. And I'm not saying, I guess when I say that, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I mean, it's there was a real virus and it had some ability to cause some big problems. I'm not saying that. So for the safety, you were talking about safety with the different cars. Are people going to do that? These are questions that I think philosophers are dealing with, but I think scientists have to deal with too, and mathematicians, because our world will change if most of the things that we do, we're interacting with really a non-sentient artificial being, for lack of a better term, than we are with actual. And then, and this is a big rabbit trail. We won't go down too far because we don't have a lot of time, but are those eternal? What if you hit the off button? What's left? Does it just reboot and forget? Again, it's just there's a lot of memory and all that things that go on. So what is it? What's necessary? I think, and this is the question we'll probably probe in later podcasts. But what's necessary for what we would call real sentience, a being that can make its own decisions, or the word we talked about a couple podcasts ago, sapience, which has to do with first person awareness with what you're doing and feelings and emotion and beauty and goodness and love and truth. And we usually don't associate those with computers, because really that's Correct. What this is, right? And so it makes and of course you bring in the religious questions, well, what does, and I think anybody, atheists wouldn't probably put that in, but almost anybody that thinks of God and their concept, well, what does God think about artificial intelligence? I mean, is God upset if we use it all the time, right? To some extent, my car has a backup camera and it will actually turn the wheel if you're hitting something, which is artificial.
Right.
It'll brake for me if I'm too close to something without me telling it to. Does God mad at me for not braking myself? You know what I mean? I mean, those questions come up, and where do we stop? Because the word safety comes into mind. Yeah. So I guess if you have any thoughts about the relationship side of things, I guess, would you say that we should maybe use some caution there?
I do. Yeah. It's things I haven't thought too much about, but I do think that having relationship with artificial intelligence really is a rabbit trail that we don't want to go down.
Yeah. And I do think, going back to not so much a rabbit, but a dog, like I talked a couple podcasts ago, you can have a relationship with your cat, with your dog, with your parrot. Heck, you can have a relationship with your fish to some extent. But don't we all realize that's different than relationship with our spouses and our kids and our parents and our friends? It's not saying that the other relationship isn't real. It's just different. I mean, if someone we love dies, we go through usually a mourning period, a grieving period, because we've lost someone we care about. And if your dog dies, I'm sure when mine dies, I won't be happy, but I'll probably just bury her in the backyard. I mean, that's what you do. I mean, it's not that it's not great, but it's different level. And maybe that's the way to look at it as we end up here, is that you can have a relationship to some extent, if you want to use that term, or relate to, let's just say that. You could relate to something that's artificial, but you have to remember this is not real. And I think that's probably a good thing. There's almost 8 billion people in the world. There's plenty of people to relate to if you want to. You don't really need to add a bunch of artificial people out there to relate to along top of that. But again, this all kind of comes back to that idea of when we talked about this a few weeks ago about when our physical self stops, our whole probing here on the life side was, is there a non-physical part that continues eternally?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that would only be sentient beings that have a soul, that have a spirit, that have something that's non-physical, that's real. Mm-hmm. And that probably on the life side of things is where we should focus our efforts more in developing those relationships than something that, and I think it's a great word, something that just is ultimately artificial.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, this has been Intersecting Us podcast. We've gone through all of the videos, I think, in podcast, all the 7 in the Eternity series. And I think the whole idea here was to get you to think about eternity. Matt does such a good job of that, getting our imagination going and looking at infinity and the things you did, Dave, to show us all these wonderful different ways of thinking of things and the beauty and the fun and the joy you get with doing that. And then bringing it into the life side and thinking about our mortality and how we're made up and what really matters. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I had thought to maybe wrap up the math part of the Eternity series in that you mentioned earlier in the podcast about kind of like schizophrenic. And it reminded me of a couple of mathematicians that dealt with really, really heavy topics. First of them was George Cantor, and he was in the 1800s. And he was the one that essentially formed our current idea of how to handle infinity in math. And what he came up with was there's different levels of infinity. And so for example, he identified that the infinite set of positive integers is the same size as the infinite set of positive even numbers.
Oh,
and even though it looks like one is way bigger than the other, he came up and said that they're the same size. But then other sets of numbers, like the real numbers, was a bigger set of infinity. And he came up with some really crazy ideas that were not accepted by the majority of math people at that time. But slowly over time, they did become accepted. But he paid a heavy price for that. He was schizophrenic. He was depressed. He spent most of his latter parts of his years in a mental institute because this topic was so heavy for him to deal with. And he saw it as not just a numbers game, but he saw kind of like how it pertained to life, that this was not just about math, but this was the bigger question about why are we here? And so it's really interesting that people have wrestled with this and struggled with it because it's heavy topics. And then the second guy was Kurt Gödel, or Gödel is the way I'd pronounce it. But he came around in the 1900s and he was a contemporary of Einstein. In fact, those guys went on walks together. And he likewise dealt with some heavy topics. But like Cantor, he ended up being kind of like insane and struggled with mental health because he, again, was dealing with this topic that we're talking about. So the bottom line is, if this topic of infinity, eternity seems heavy, it's because it is heavy. And there's so much to think about, but that doesn't mean that there's not been some amazing things that others before us have uncovered. And it's fun to kind of think about their ideas and how that impacts our life today.
And I think philosophically, one of the things that may not be foolproof, but that can help people that think about things deeply like that, because you do have there's philosophers that have kind of gone off the deep end and struggled mentally because of thinking of eternity and these things. I think doing it in a community is so much better to have people. That's kind of what we're trying to do here. If these things are things that people think about, give us some comments, some questions. It's better to do together, and even the more the merrier, because then there are things that maybe these two guys, if they'd have just had a couple partners to talk to about, they may have been able to look at it from a little bit different perspective and maybe get a handle on it and try to look at, because ultimately it comes down to when people kind of, get that problem psychologically, it's because they don't see, they're having trouble with purpose, meaning, and existence, and they don't have anybody to see that. And so, for all of this, I guess we could kind of end with this, what we're hoping you do. It's great to think about things. It's great to think about a lot of different things, but what we really want you to do is not think about something, but make sure in your life that the most important things are thinking about someone or someones, because ultimately you're going to find your purpose in other people and those relationships that come with it.
This has been the Intersecting Us podcast. To further engage with Intersecting Us, go to intersectingus.com.